Hi, Rod. Welcome back to
Hi,
10.6.
thanks for having me on
Fascinating,
again.
and our pleasure as usual. Fascinating topic today: corporate crime. Um, and I guess that you looked at the charge sheet on this, it would take us a lot longer than the time that we have in order to read it out and to analyse. But I'm sure you're going to do a splendid job in summarising that. So over to you, Rod.
Thanks very much for that introduction. So last week we talked about how the economy is rigged to enable big companies to extract what I called a free lunch. And in discussing that, we suggested that big companies do a lot of very unethical activities, but in fact, it's far worse than that. They do a lot of actively criminal activities, and just occasionally you'll hear about one or two of these on the mainstream media, and they'll say that a particular company, maybe it's a financial company, has committed a fraud or something, and everyone will think, oh well, that's just a one-off. But in fact, it's never just a one-off. This is how the system works. What you find is that crime is all around us when we analyze what big companies do. And in fact, the problem is that all of these white-collar criminals, if you look at the total harm that they do to our societies, it's absolutely enormous, but nobody's talking about it and nobody's attempting to do anything about it. So here we're going to spend today's session just kind of giving you a brief overview so you get some idea of just how much is going on every day. So I'm going to sort of start by going back in history a little bit. So it's always been the case that the biggest and most powerful companies have committed serious crimes. So most famously, the British East India Company, which actually had control of India for many years. It operated basically as an extension of the British government. It committed all sorts of atrocities, including widespread murder and torture. And in fact, there were a number of very, very serious famines leading to the deaths of millions of people. And these were not accidental. These were due to the policies of the British East India Company. And then if we jump over to the United States, many people will have heard the expression robber barons. So these were the sort of captains of industry in America in the past. So these were the people who ran the oil companies, the banking companies, the steel companies, and the railroad companies. And they were notoriously able to carry out murder, kidnapping, and extortion on a sort of national scale. And it was being done with the backing of the government. So corporate crime is nothing new. But the breadth of it, I think, is something that people will be slightly shocked by. So if you look at specific crimes in the present day, it includes manslaughter in many countries, very widespread pollution, enormous frauds. So we'll talk about some specific examples of those in the first half, and then we'll discuss how this has come about a little bit more in the second half. So some people will be aware that a few years ago, the car company Volkswagen was caught manipulating its emissions data, pretending that its cars put out fewer emissions than it claimed. Claiming it put out fewer emissions than it actually did. So this applies to sort of almost all big companies in terms of fraud and so on. So WikiLeaks told us about a very famous incident where the company Trafigura was dumping toxic waste off the coast of Africa. And the evidence indicates that this may well have harmed over 100,000 people because of the toxic waste that was in the water that would then affect the fish stocks and so on. So many people needed medical assistance in Ivory Coast due to the toxic dumping. But again, nobody's prosecuted, nothing is done about it. Some people will have heard of the Deepwater Horizon oil explosions and the oil spills that resulted from that. And this was due to cost cutting and negligence by the senior management in the oil company. And the most famous case of all, and if people have never heard of this, it is worth actually going to check this out, is a company called Enron. So this was an energy trading company in California about 20 years ago. And they'd lobbied the government to deregulate the energy markets. And they realized that by controlling the energy supply and manipulating whether or not a power station was shut down for maintenance at the right time, it could create a shortage of energy and then put the prices up and make vast profits just by gaming the system. And in fact, investigators realized there were dozens and dozens of scams that Enron traders were carrying out in all sorts of complex ways about manipulating whether energy came from inside the state or outside the state, and about how you have energy bottlenecks in some of the lines that carry the energy and so on. So fraud after fraud after fraud with billions of dollars. And it was enabled by fraudulent accounting and fraudulent banking, where the financiers helped set up fake companies offshore and they created fake transactions. So all sorts of complex frauds carrying on. So people hear occasionally about these cases, but they think that these are just kind of bad apples. But in fact, these are just the tip of an absolutely enormous iceberg. This type of fraudulent criminal activity is going on all around us every day. So for example, all of the big pharmaceutical companies, those are the ones who develop our medicines, have been fined enormous amounts of money. We're talking billions of dollars for fraud. All of the big weapons companies commit fraud and illegal activities. And in fact, many people consider that the weapons industry is the most criminal industry in the world. And so last week we were talking about how these companies receive unearned profits. Well, they make a great deal of unearned profits by committing criminal acts. So if you look at some sort of types of ways they manipulate things, many big companies have been caught price fixing. So some people talk about a cartel, which is a group of companies actively working together to manipulate prices. So the most famous of these was actually the big 7 oil companies, right back as far as 1928, where they actually divided up the world's oil resources between them and agreed to sort of split them up and then make sure there was no competition so they could keep prices high to make astronomical profits in the oil industry. And then famously, in the 20th century, there were 3 major American car companies that didn't really have much competition at that point from Britain or Japan or other international car manufacturers. So they colluded to block the introduction of safety equipment in order to keep their profits high. And some people may have heard of the notorious incident where the Ford Pinto car was known to explode in certain types of collisions, and yet Ford chose not to recall the cars to change the components because they thought they would make more profit by not recalling the cars and just occasionally paying out compensation to people who had died in the car fires. And then more recently, we've seen examples where British Airways and Virgin have colluded in relation to the price of flights. Insurance companies, energy suppliers, mobile phone companies and utility companies have all been caught fixing prices. And if you look at certain European websites, so there's a European regulator that investigates price fixing. Now they have admitted that they do not have the personnel to investigate everything they would like. They can only investigate a small proportion of what they would like. But if you look at their website, even in the last few months, they've listed examples where they find companies for colluding in the food packaging industry, the canned vegetables industry, and the car parts industry. So in fact, you start to realize that it's everywhere. There is no sort of industry which is exempt from, if it's got powerful companies operating within it, they will attempt to rip off customers by rigging prices and working with what should be their competitors to keep prices high. If we look, say, at the financial system, this is something that's so important. We'll actually do whole presentations about it later on, but it's worth mentioning now as an example of what's called regulatory capture. So in 2008, we had the big financial crisis, and people realized that banks had been committing fraud after fraud, betting against their customers, in fact. And the regulator at the time was called the FSA, the Financial Services Authority. And basically, everyone realized that this regulator was just unfit for purpose. They didn't see their role as policing the banks. They saw it as enabling the banks to do what they wanted to do. So that regulator has been shut down. But from what I've seen, there's no real evidence that the replacement regulators are actually doing a better job of regulating the financial industry at all. So I describe the world's financial industry simply as a global set of interconnected frauds, and there's no sign that that's going to change in the near future. If you look at the United States, we can see very clear examples of what we call regulatory capture. So they have certain regulators, so they have an environmental protection agency, they have a Food and Drug Administration, and they're meant to regulate certain industries. And all of their senior personnel have very, very strong connections to the industries they come from, and they have no real interest in regulating those industries. And most recently, we've seen clear evidence that the pharmaceutical regulators in both Britain and America are really not trying very hard to regulate the pharmaceutical industry seriously. And so we've talked in the past about revolving doors, where senior people from business go into government and regulatory agencies and vice versa. And this means that all of the senior people in the regulatory system and in government see the world from the point of view of big business. So they actually enable businesses to get away with the frauds that they commit. And when people try to blow the whistle on this, the whistleblowers get sacked or prosecuted or persecuted, but the people who've been carrying out the crimes that have been exposed by the whistleblowing, it's very rare that any action is taken against them. Now, this is in advanced nations. Now, we do actually have regulators in advanced nations. What you start to realize is that in poor countries, often they have much weaker regulation and sometimes barely any regulation at all. So we have an enormous amount of international exploitation of suppliers, let's say providing cotton or providing coffee. Those would be the two most notorious industries where people overseas are exploited. But we also have enormous amounts of pollution from, say, mining companies. So they poison the air and the water and the soil of poor countries. And last week, I think you mentioned the Union Carbide disaster in India, where poisonous gas killed thousands of people. And yet nobody was really held to account for that crime. And some people will remember that there was some incidents in Nigeria some years ago relating to Shell, and where people were actually murdered because they were protesting against the activities of Shell in Nigeria. Now, I researched this in some detail, and what I discovered is that you can't really separate Shell from the Nigerian government. Actually, there is so much overlap between the senior personnel, they essentially become one organization. So what we're seeing is what we might call state corporate crime, where they will kill protesters to achieve their goals and to extract resources such as oil. And this is not a one-off with Shell. This is actually widespread among mining companies the world over. So notoriously, again, the mining company Freeport has a big mining operation in Indonesia. And on a regular basis, the security staff actually kill local people. But again, nobody is held to account for that. Nobody is prosecuted. The government are actually on the side of the criminals. So whilst we talk about crimes, there is an interesting sort of gray area in that if a company and its lawyers and its lobbyists end up writing the laws, then something that you or I would call a serious crime may not even technically be a crime, either in Britain or America or in a poor country. We would simply say it's an unethical activity, but it's not technically against the law because the laws have been adjusted or adapted or rewritten, and in many poor countries, the laws don't exist at all. So if you look at something like Bangladesh, there was a famous incident a few years ago. Some people will be familiar with the term Rana Plaza, which is where a whole building, which was used to produce clothing, collapsed and killed large numbers of people. And that was despite the fact that the day before, people had noticed cracks in the building. And yet the operations just carried on as normal. And it's only when large numbers of people die that anybody hears about this at all. But actually, this type of criminal negligence is happening all the time in poor countries. And one of the things that we see about big companies in Britain and America and Europe outsourcing their productive activities to poor countries is that it enables them to pass the buck. They can avoid responsibility for what happens in poor countries. So we see lots of examples over time of different companies doing different things. So famously, back in I think it was the 1980s, Nestle was selling powdered milk to new mothers to encourage them to use their milk instead of breastfeeding. Now, this goes against all medical advice in terms of what is healthiest for children. And Nestle eventually got a bit of a bad reputation because this was so widespread. But in general, these companies will try to do this sort of thing because their focus is not on the health of communities in other countries or even the health of people here. It's on profit, and they don't care about the harm that they do to societies. So more recently, we've seen Coca-Cola appeared in the news occasionally because their production processes using large quantities of oil, and they were actually dehydrating the water supplies for local communities and farmers. So in fact, in a number of countries, including India or parts of India, Coca-Cola's activities were actually banned because they were having such harmful consequences on local communities. And so the idea of food companies exploiting their suppliers, let's say with coffee companies, this has been discussed many times in the West. Once in a blue moon, it'll appear in the media. Sometimes somebody will make a film about it. So there's a film called Black Gold showing how coffee growers in Africa are being exploited. But in fact, nothing is done. And I checked the data recently. The situation is now worse for coffee growers in developing countries than it was when that movie was made. So the trend tends to be in the wrong direction. And we see when British or American water companies take control of the water supplies in developing countries, what they want, again, is to put prices up to make more profit. And there are examples where they've cut the water supply off to the poorest people. And we've seen the outbreak of diseases, which had sort of been non-existent in that region for some time. So these activities in the third world or the developing world, we will talk about a lot more in a few weeks' time, where we're going to really focus on exactly what it is that advanced nations and their companies do in poor countries that have such detrimental consequences for poor people all over the world. But one thing that I do want to mention whilst I'm talking about what goes on in poor countries is the role of medical companies or pharmaceutical companies who can make more profit by stopping poor people getting low-cost medicines than by supplying them. And the control of patents is incredibly important to them. And so famously, we saw with the blocking of AIDS medicines in Africa, that many people with AIDS died in Africa because they couldn't get cheap medicines and so on. And so again, we'll have a special session all about patents in a few weeks' time. So if we look at what's happened in advanced nations in relation to, say, tobacco companies, we know that they lied, even under oath, about their knowledge that nicotine was harmful. They manipulated the research data, and even though in advanced nations we've to some extent limited the damage that they're doing, the problem has not gone away, it's just changed location. So in fact, tobacco companies to this day devote vast resources to getting children addicted to smoking in countries such as Malawi and Indonesia. And those countries have more and more problems with healthcare issues due to smoking. And in those countries, they can get away with cigarettes that are even more addictive because they have even weaker regulations. And in fact, there's a great example of the way the system works that about 30 years ago, Taiwan had a state monopoly on tobacco. Very little tobacco was sold. There were very few health problems due to tobacco, but American companies, tobacco companies, wanted to sell and advertise in Taiwan and other Asian countries. So they went to the US government, who then threatened the Taiwanese government with sanctions if they didn't let American companies sell and advertise in Taiwan. And Taiwan backed down. They allow American companies and British companies and other companies from advanced nations to sell and advertise tobacco in their country. Tobacco has increased many-fold, but the the health problems due to smoking have also increased manyfold because of that. And then I want to highlight specifically an Australian case where there were some asbestos companies, and they also lied under oath for the best part of 30 years about their knowledge that asbestos is harmful, but they carried on using it. Eventually, they had to pay significant amounts of compensation, but it was all rather too late. So it's important to understand this is not a case of governments in advanced nations being unable to regulate companies. It's governments in advanced nations working with these companies to help them exploit not only countries overseas, but actually to exploit ordinary people in advanced nations. So we had a clear example of one of these examples of collusion between the government and weapons companies, where British Aerospace was selling weapons to the Saudis, and they were paying enormous bribes. I believe the biggest bribe was £7 billion. The police wanted to investigate, but the British government stepped in to block the investigation. And over again, we find evidence that US and British negotiators actually block stricter regulation in other countries. So we had an example a few years ago where British negotiators and the British government went out of their way to block stricter regulation in Europe after the banks had caused the financial crisis. So our governments actively work with the most powerful sort of corporate leaders to rig the system in a very unethical and to some extent criminal way. And I think I've mentioned before that the UN tried for about 20 years to come up with a global code of conduct which would properly regulate big companies, but they gave up after about 20 years because there were too many vested interests who were trying to stop them. Okay, so if we look a little bit at the theory about what's sort of going on, there's a great book called The Corporation by a writer called Joel Backer, and it was made into a movie. And in fact, just recently, they've come up with a follow-up called The Corporation 2, The Unfortunately Necessary Sequel. And in the book, they compared big companies to psychopaths. And they said, listen, if you or I did what big companies do, we would be in jail for a very, very long time. Their activities are completely insane. They are pursuing their own profit, causing immense harm to society and to individuals all over the world, and nobody is doing anything about it. And so when they were being interviewed about the second one that's just come out, they were saying, look, if you look at many of the things that are important around the world, so economic inequality, the failures of democracy, environmental issues, climate change, species extinction, education, and welfare, in many places, these are now at crisis levels. They had hoped when they made the first film, which was about 20 years ago, that actually people would have sort of woken up and started to change the way companies behave. But in fact, everything is still heading in the wrong direction. So the focus is more and more on corporate profit, irrespective of the downsides to everyone else. Now, partly this has come about because of a bizarre legal ruling in America in 1886, where corporate lawyers managed to take a law that was meant to give rights to freed slaves, to say those rights should apply to companies. And that's pretty much the situation now. So in a sense, companies now have the same rights as people. But in fact, because of their immense power, and because if you look at international agreements and what big companies are able to do, actually in practice, they have more rights than people, but they have at the same time fewer responsibilities. And that is because they are able to operate outside the law. They can manipulate the law, and where they are caught breaking the law, the only penalty is nearly always a fine, and the fine is never enough to stop their activities. So the fine becomes just the cost of doing business. So we've actually made companies not only bigger and more powerful and wealthier than people, we've given them more legal rights than people and fewer legal responsibilities than people. So this whole situation is completely insane. And in fact, I'm just sort of writing some more sort of beginner's guides at the moment that ask the question, what happens when the biggest criminals make the law? And this applies to corporate criminals, but it'll also discuss the role of the biggest war criminals, so that's Britain and America, that they make the laws in their home countries that stop anyone being able to prosecute them for their crimes. So you realize there is this huge gray area between unethical activities and criminal activities when they make the laws. And in a reasonable society, a great deal of what big companies would do would be called criminal, and executives would be locked up in large numbers for a very long period of time. So part of this problem relates to size and power. And I keep coming back to this phrase, power corrupts, which I keep saying to everyone, I think is one of the most important phrases in all of human history. So if you look at some of the bigger companies, so Walmart, one of the biggest supermarket companies in America, but now has international operations, they employ over 2 million people, and yet they are notorious for exploiting their staff. If you look at Apple, who were the most profitable company in 2019, they had profits of $55 billion. That's an astonishing amount of profit for one company to make. And yet again, they had had issues for many years about exploiting the people who work at their subcontractors overseas. So I've talked before about how one of the most important aspects of successful propaganda has been about the profit motive, that it's okay for all businesses, however big or small they are, to pursue their own profit. And no distinction is ever made between big companies and small companies. And yet, as we pointed out last week, the economists writing 100 years ago, famously, such as Adam Smith, pointed out that you have to treat big companies very, very difficult from small companies. So we need to move away from this idea that the focus on shareholder profits in big companies should be the main focus. That's never, ever going to create ethical systems. So there's a problem with the way the media talk about these things. They present corporate wrongdoing as a sort of a bad apple, a one-off, without saying actually the whole system is rotten, and without talking about the widespread harm that is being caused by these both criminal and unethical acts. So the crimes appear in the media one at a time, and nobody ever kind of joins the dots and says, actually, the whole system. So in fact, I've never, ever seen anyone in the mainstream media have a conversation where they've asked the question, would the world be better off without such powerful corporations pursuing their profits? That question is never asked. And yet, to me, once you have an understanding of what goes on, it becomes obvious that we would be much better off without such powerful organizations pursuing their own profits. So there's one final thing that I want to sort of mention, and that is the role of sort of corporate propaganda. So we've talked about this a little bit in the past. There's a specific area which is corporate social responsibility, which is one of these great big public relations myths. So it's about companies saying, yes, we are trying harder, we're going to be greener, we're going to be more socially responsible, we're going to do things more sustainably. And a big company will say, look, we spent a few £1,000s building a school in a poor country, aren't we wonderful? But in fact, all of this is just a smokescreen. In fact, it becomes very clear when you examine it that the companies with the worst sort of human rights records, that will be oil and mining and tobacco companies, they're the ones that hype CSR the most. And it's all just a PR smokescreen. So in fact, we need to start thinking very, very seriously about the whole structure of corporations. And again, this is something I've never seen anyone discuss in the mainstream. Somebody saying, actually, could we simplify companies completely so we don't allow layer upon layer of subsidiaries, holding companies, offshore subsidiaries, all sorts of things? Could we actually just simplify corporate structures altogether and then make the executives genuinely accountable for the harms that their companies are causing? Okay, I think that's probably a good point to open up for a sort of general discussion.
Brilliant, thank you, Rod. I mean, the charge sheet, as you identified, is just that was just an example of, as you rightly stated, that there are so many acts over hundreds of years, dating back to the 19th century, that are criminal.
Absolutely, yeah.
And when I've taken a few notes, and I've got a particularly controversial point I'd like to stretch to later. Just a quickie though, just for legal reasons, and I've got no reason to challenge you really on this apart from sort of intuitively. You said Ford Pinto. Did you mean Fiat Pinto?
No, Ford Pinto. It's an American car.
Fantastic, thank you. That's fine. Just in case anyone was watching and,
they
decided to contact Ford and yeah, no, that's cool, brilliant. Thank you very much. I'll go in order because otherwise I'll get a bit confused with myself. This whole nature, as we both said, is about corporations acting illegally. I think the greatest example, and you gave some wonderful examples, if that's not oxymoronic, obviously, but you gave some great examples, but I think probably the classic example were the revelations that came out post World War II of how many corporations were still working with the Nazis throughout the Second World War and contributed to them making their armaments and the Cyclone B gas that was used to kill obviously so many Jewish people, but other demographics too. And yet they, maybe they should have been standing next to the likes of Goering, etc., at the Nuremberg trials, because the role that they played was to supply these psychopaths. And it does lead into a question that I've actually sort of set here. And you talked about from the book and the film, The Corporation, and the follow-up, about very much a close identification between corporations and psychopathy. And the same sort of situation exists in John Ronson's book, The Psychopath Test. And so many people are clearly making this correlation, so to speak, this relationship. But we could ask the question then, are the corporations in themselves adopting Nazi behavior? Are, what we associate with being a Nazi in terms of the mass extermination of people, even though it was more explicit in terms of the Nazi Party from the early 40s onwards, the impact of the fast food, the impact of the oil machine, the impact of the destruction on the climate, all knowingly going on, tobacco, pharmaceuticals, etc., all knowingly going on, and yet profit is the only incentive, and destruction is probably a word that they're not even allowed to speak. So you could argue, couldn't you, that even though the depiction of the Nazi Party very much to do with war, to do with extermination, but that the corporations themselves are very similar.
Well, so I think that's an interesting sort of comparison, and I think you can see it with specific industries of just how similar. So the obvious ones would be tobacco, in terms of the millions of people who died far younger than they would have done otherwise because of tobacco products. But also if you look at the weapons companies and their role in supplying mass murderers. And in fact, there are a number of examples that I had so many examples, I decided I can't cover everything in a presentation. And so there's a sort of one or two notorious ones that I sort of left out. And so in fact, John Pilger, the writer and the sort of critic of governments, wrote an excellent book some years ago called The New Rulers of the World. And the first quarter of the book was a great analysis of what happened in Indonesia back in the 1960s and the role of very, very big companies. I actually had I'm just going to have a quick look at it. I wrote to them now. General Motors and American Express were actively working with the dictator who was committing genocide in Indonesia. And they were working to take control of parts of the Indonesian economy and so on. And so you start to realize that, that I think this idea that they are responsible for large numbers of deaths is a really important point. And I think to some extent, they escape criticism for that simply because our governments don't want them to be known for their roles. Our governments don't want the companies to be known for what they do overseas and so on, and the harms they cause and this sort of thing. And so governments essentially protect many of these extremely powerful and extremely profitable companies. And I think if they didn't have the protection of governments in advanced nations like Britain and America, then it would be that much easier for ordinary people to really start to understand what companies do and to have a much more critical conversation. But the protection is not just governments, but because the media have a role, a propaganda role that we've discussed many times, where they encourage people to buy into the system, and that includes buying into the corporate system. Again, the media doesn't really do general criticism at all. It protects the system. So it will criticize a specific company like Enron or a bank after the financial crisis, but it won't say we need to really think about the system. So there's so many layers of protection, it becomes very difficult for people to have an honest conversation about just how harmful these companies are. And in fact, whilst I was sort of preparing this morning, I was just checking up what is the current status of this corporation film number 2. Because I understand that the producer, Joel Backen, and his colleagues have had real trouble trying to get it distributed and marketed. And they actually put something on their website saying they're in a dispute with Twitter at the moment because Twitter banned them promoting their film because the film is so critical of corporate activity. So you start to realize there are many sort of layers of powerful people and organizations protecting the idea that what companies do is reasonable. And it's going to be a huge challenge to get past all these layers of protection to really start having an honest debate about what companies do. But if people are interested in really understanding this better, they can see the old film, The Corporation, which is still just as relevant today. They can read the old book. There is a new book that's out and available, and they can try and support the new Corporation film that the producers are trying to get shown in festivals and screenings all over the world as best they can.
Yeah, that in itself stimulates probably a discussion we need to have another time, because there's a very significant number of people who are very knowledgeable, who have spent large parts of their life reading and uncovering information that the vast majority simply aren't aware of.
Yeah.
And yet they sort of tend to hit then a cul-de-sac, because where do they go with all this knowledge if you've got the corporations and the governments acting like criminals, making the law so that what they do is largely not criminal. But whereas, like you identified, the responsibility doesn't sit with them, but with the individual. If they behave like this, then there is the criminal attachment. It's usually the smaller person who's then locked up or stigmatized, harassed, and sometimes murdered in order to get them out of the way if they become problematic. But anyway, I think that's a conversation for another day. Coming back to the Alan Clark, for example, in one of the John Pilger documentaries around the East Timor genocide, and he freely admitted that British aerospace and American and UK arms companies and manufacturers were selling the planes to Indonesia, but he said, but they weren't planes to kill people. And John Pilger then said, yes, but it probably took them hours to do the modifications, which you were fully aware. And of course, he puts up his hand, but that's not our responsibility. We just provided the planes. We didn't provide what was used to kill. And anybody who's got any morality or interest in that topic will just shake their heads, because you have got these sociopaths and psychopaths who blandly say these things that are utterly meaningless, apart from in their own imaginations. And yet there's thousands, if not millions, of people who are being killed and murdered by these fascistic leaderships. And I don't just mean that in government, I also mean that in corporations, who pay the price.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. So I think there is this thing that we've highlighted before, that our systems, both political and corporate, seem to encourage the most insane people to rise to the top. And every now and again, as you say, that old interview with Alan Clark and so on, you just see these little glimpses of what, the fact that these people really do not care about how much harm is done to others, and just how little empathy they have, and they just see sort of themselves as part of this small elite club, and it goes right back through history, where there have always been a tiny number of rich, powerful people who mostly have made the decisions, and everybody else has had to sort of live with that, and the consequences have been disastrous in country after country for throughout history. And often, if I hear on the news people talking about, let's say, slavery, people in the mainstream media will say, oh yeah, but you have to remember times were different then, it's a different sort of mindset. But I actually think it's not that different. The mindset then was a tiny elite who believed they had the right to own slaves. And still to this day, we have a tiny elite who believe they have the right to cause immense harms all over the world. And they don't want anyone else to have any power to control what they do. No.
And they will have their servants, they will have their maids, they'll pay them peanuts, relatively speaking, but argue that they're not slaves. And yet, for many of these people, it's really, really challenging to find a job. And the only reason they've demeaned themselves so much to work for these people is because the competition for work is so great. Yeah, absolutely.
There's a point I want to make. It's slightly a digression from the corporate crime thing, but it's related. In that it's always shocked me how, if you look at a country like India, which has been on the receiving end of British imperialism for a long time, and they've got their independence, that the successful people in India, they learn tech skills and IT skills, and then many of them are only too ready and willing to come and work for Google and to come and work for the companies that have participated over the years in their oppression and are continuing with that to this day. And it's as if there's this kind of disconnect, and that they're so keen to be successful as individuals and to be seen as successful by their families and so on, that the bigger picture of the harms that their employers do is something they push to one side. And yet they, more than anybody, should be aware of the historical harms that these companies have done.
Yeah, but I also guess, though, that if you are surrounded by tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people in poverty,
absolutely,
then challenging the hegemony, the status quo, is more likely to lead you to that place. So therefore, you're being conditioned by these middle-class Indian families. You'll be given an education that most of the population don't receive. You end up going to California and working for these tech companies or whatever. And it's like anywhere else in the world. It's the conditioning, it's the socialization. And as you rightly identified before, it's the psychology that's impacting so immensely upon these individuals that the history of their nation is not relevant to their individual atomized position at any given time.
Sure. Yeah.
So unless they're brought up in a home where they're taught the history, and they're taught to fight back. They're taught to stand up to it. If they're not given that psychology within their conditioning and their socialization, it ain't going to happen, just like with everybody else.
Yeah.
Moving on to another example, when it's coming up next year, the 2022 World Cup, and many governments and certainly the corporations have turned a blind eye to the number of deaths amongst the construction workers of the stadia in Qatar. And again, it's this global celebration. It's this opportunity to make lots and lots and lots of money, to have lots of kudos and status, to have the best seats in the stadia, to watch the matches, the best matches. And there's no consideration. I mean, we saw also, I think, with the Qatari 2020 World Cup in the cricket, and the number of times that the camera people were homing in on these rich people from the Arab states who had these best seats, and how they brought in all these beautiful women that the cameramen are also spending so much time focusing in on. And that becomes the reality. It's not the reality of what's going on outside the stadium, the reality of how the stadium were built. All those other issues are completely ignored by the corporations, that they don't want to get involved in that, because it's sport, and therefore because it's sport, it's where people switch off from reality.
This is
Can I just say that becomes the media televisual experience, switching off from reality instead of confronting it.
So I think that's a very good description. And in fact, one of the things that I'm researching at the moment, and in fact, there's a British writer who's starting to write about this quite a lot, called Jonathan Cook, who's starting to write more and more about sort of corporate harms and so on, and talking about how advertising is this very clever kind of PR strategy to create a disconnect between what companies actually sell you and the positive associations you have with that, and what went on behind the scenes to create that, and the corporate harms that took place, and so, and to create this massive disconnect. So we never see the harms, that we always only focus on the positives and so on. And in fact, this is something that really disappoints me about sport. So I actually think that sports people could really make a difference because of their celebrity status if they chose to make a difference, but they mostly actively choose not to. And so you won't see very often cricketers saying, we won't go to this country because of the human rights issue there. And I think it's a sign that what I describe as the corporate mindset, which is this incessant focus on profit and nothing else, actually ends up in our wider society. And you can see it in universities, and you can see it in these international sporting things such as the Olympics and so on. And profit becomes the only thing that matters. And whilst it all looks superficially wonderful on TV and so on, as you say, what's going on behind the scenes and the hidden cost of these things is all hidden away so nobody can see it. And I think it's a real shame that people in sport don't make more effort to kind of engage with this. And unfortunately, I think you can understand the psychology. One of the things that interested me was, I remember being in New Zealand one year when the Olympics were on, and a couple of Olympic gold medals were won by people from New Zealand. Immediately the next day, they're on television advertising McDonald's and Coca-Cola and all the other junk food stuff. Now, I understand that life can be quite challenging in some minority sports to keep it funded and so on. But to just suddenly take the corporate dollar and not to engage with the harms of these companies, I find incredibly disappointing. But I don't think there are many sports people that I've come across who've genuinely tried to engage with any of this.
Yeah, and when they do, it really stands out. I mean, there's two examples, obviously. If you go back to before the emancipation of South Africa, when Nelson Mandela was released and apartheid was shut down, you have the the cricketers who went to South Africa, but they were banned then from playing for England, and a lot of publicity around those particular individuals, how they sold their souls for the dollar or the South African currency, as it is or was. But you had lots of England cricketers who said, no, I'm not going. I prefer to stay and play for England. I'm not prepared to sacrifice my careers by going to take a payoff by playing in South Africa during that time. And yet, historically, I mean, if obviously to younger people it's different, but historically that still stands out. And the problem is it stands out because it is so unusual.
Yeah.
But then at the current time, we have the taking the knee before many football matches. And initially we had, certain crowds around the country when they came back who booed the taking of the knee. We had a lot of racist rubbish on Twitter. Yet we still have the taking of the knee. And the argument that's put out even by Sky, the corporate media companies, is that these people continue to boo people at football matches shows us that the taking of the knee is still really, really important. And the footballers have turned around and said, so therefore we are going to continue. So there's a whole philosophical debate about taking the knee, whether it's just symbolic and whether it's really making any difference. But the point is, again, we do have an example where the corporations are prepared to say, or in this instance, Sky and BT, are prepared to say that it's important to inform people before every match and to highlight the importance of taking the knee. But yet again, it's one of those things that tends to have split the country. And I think it's quite sad as well that it's also perceived to be very much racism perceived to be a working class problem. And it is, it is a problem within the working classes, but it's not a working class problem. Because the assumption is that most people who go to football matches come from a working class background. And the argument, from the right is that, well, they pay their ticket prices, therefore they should be able to express themselves in whichever way they want, which of course from the left or the liberal position is completely outrageous.
So quite a lot of points there. I won't engage with the sort of taking the knee specifically. I'll start with what we started out by saying about how the protests in relation to South Africa stand out because they were so unusual. I think that's a really, really important point, in that just occasionally some issue like that does get into the mainstream media and it becomes something that is talked about in the mainstream media. But the things that I would see as the most important never get into the mainstream media. And so you never have people protesting and saying, I won't go to the Olympics in the United States because of their war record. And even more, you never see a British sportsperson saying, I will not represent Great Britain because our government are committing war crimes and things like that. And you never see an American sportsperson saying, I won't represent America because of our foreign policy record and so on. So there are certain issues that occasionally sort of achieve a status where they are talked about more widely and people get involved to some extent in different actions relative to that. But the really big stuff is sort of missing. And one of the things I would like to see is people being more critical of the corporate sponsors of the football teams. Because again, we need to start looking at the records of these companies because many of them do not have a great track record. And yet again, because the supporters like the fact that they're getting funding for their sport and their team, they actually see it as a positive. But actually we've got to dig deeper and look behind the scenes and have a much more complex, sophisticated debate about all of these sort of related topics.
And I guess, Rod, to be fair on these athletes, if their parents or members of their family have been taking them to the local swimming pool every morning at 5 o'clock in the morning or to the local racetrack 5 times a week or whatever it is, and they've got to the position where they've been chosen to represent their country in the Olympics, it's not just about saying, if you've had that political socialization, it's not just about saying, I'm not prepared to go to the Olympics because of the war records. You then have to sit down with all your family and explain to them why that is more important than the last 15 years of them taking you to training every day. So that in itself means that it's chances of it happening, the probability of it happening are so minute.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that people do kind of protest about the involvement of certain other countries. Let's say Russia was highlighted a few years ago. And so people competing at the last Olympics were competing not as representatives of Russia, but as the Russian something, I can't remember what the phrase was. So they were competing as independent sports people. Now that's because the mainstream media in Britain and America and other countries had made an issue about the Russian state's involvement in drugs. So people are prepared to make a statement sometimes in relation to specific things. And I agree entirely with you that there's a huge load of reasons why very few people ever will. But I think there are a small number of very intelligent sports people who do understand a little bit about what goes on in the world, who I wish they would be more prepared to get engaged in politics and not try to separate the whole thing out.
But I think it's politically convenient for the US government, the UK government, the French government, or whatever, to make some sort of posture about Russian states and their use of drugs. If we'd found, for example, that all these drug takers were coming out of Texas or Hawaii or Alaska or wherever, Seattle, there would be nothing. There'd be hardly anything in the Western media. So it's just political expediency. It's not about morality. It's just about, again, convincing people that the big bad wolf is over there, and you need to stand up to the big bad wolf. And actually, while you're looking over there, actually there's a wolf that's 3 times the size, consuming 3 times the number of people the other side of you. But don't worry about them, because we're friendly with them.
Yeah.
So it's unfortunately it's just rank hypocrisy. It's not about taking a specific moral position that you can generalize globally. Coming back to tobacco, I don't know if you remember the Marlboro Man.
Yes, I do. I even met somebody who claimed to have been part of the advertising campaign. I think they had a lot of them over the years.
Yes,
I met one in America once.
Yes, I mean the media's conspiring with the tobacco companies is classically laid out, obviously, in the Marlboro Man. Are you aware of how the Marlboro Man died?
I'm not aware of that. No.
Have a wild stab in the dark. How do you think the Marlboro Man died?
Tobacco-related illness.
Lung cancer.
Yeah.
Yes, that's kept very quiet, interestingly, and yet because of that conspiring between the media and the corporations in relation to tobacco, the Marlboro Man has now become symbolic of millions of people around the world who've died of lung cancer as a direct result of all this false messaging and hiding the epidemiological consequences of the consumption of tobacco, which I think is ironic, but also extremely interesting.
Yeah.
The fines, we talk about the fines not being big enough for the corporations. To be fair, whatever happens in terms of fines, it's only ever passed on back to us.
So that is really the point, that we need to rethink how companies need to function relative to society. And a system of fines is never really going to work. A system of personal fines against executives, if they were very high, might have some impact. But it needs to be about...
But can I interrupt, Rod? Can I interrupt? I think the problem there is, of course, is if they're that high up, then all they would have to do, and they'd probably take it out through the corporation, is to insure themselves against the fines.
Well, that would be interesting to see if insurance companies would allow that to happen. So, but anyway, so that's a bit of
It
hypothetical.
helps if you
But
own
my,
them.
my point would be that we need to change the way we think about it and say that actually fines are not a way to do things, because that means you've let somebody commit a crime or an unethical act and you've just given them a slap on the wrist. What we're saying is the law needs to be the law and you must not break it. It needs to be something that you do not break. You know, so if we had a law that said, hey, you can't walk down the street and shoot somebody in the head, oh, and if you break that law, we'll just give you a little fine. That obviously wouldn't work. So you have to have the law being a set of rules that people do not break. And so you start to realize you have to have a kind of ethical framework within which even the biggest companies have to operate. So you have to completely change the whole mindset of how we deal with big companies. So ideally, we would have a system where big companies were not tempted to break the law or break the regulations in the first place, because there was no incentive for them to do so. And whilst you have powerful companies and a profit motive, they will always have an incentive to do so. And which is why I always come back to the idea that says that we need to treat really big companies completely differently and say their goal is to serve society and it's not about profits and so on. And that would need a complete rethink to how we deal with companies and whether they become extensions of the state and so on.
You know, just the very final point then, that would also by extension require a massive radical overhaul of the criminal and the civil law and the justice system and how it works in practice, because we know that the corporations can break the law, but they can also get the best lawyers. But we also know that you and I and the atomization of all the public, when it comes to getting the lawyers, we cannot afford anything like the quality and the experience. So even though some may argue that, you know, we are all equal under the law, it stops at the point in which you actually want to test that.
Yeah.
But
so
how you overcome, what solution, or how we overcome that second bit, the bit where there are lawyers out there that charge $100,000 an hour because of their experience and their victory records, compared to, you know, the Joe on, you know, in the normal practices that charge £150 an hour, and get completely different outcomes. That in itself is, you know, requires a miracle.
Yeah. So this is the interesting thing. The more you sort of examine how the system works, the more you realize how many aspects of the system need to change. And so what I'm writing at the moment is a thing specifically about how the law, in the same way that last week we said that, look, you cannot have a level playing field when you start out with great inequality. In fact, that also applies to the law. The law should apply to everyone equally. But when you start out with rich people who can afford the best lawyers, as you've just said, and ordinary people who really can't afford good lawyers at all, then you don't have equality under the law. And so we need to really go back to first principles and say, how can we take the idea of immense wealth out of the legal system? And other countries have entirely different legal systems. So a judge is essentially an arbitrator, and the two parties don't necessarily have legal representatives. They're there in person to put forward their case. Now, I haven't studied these in any great detail, and I can't say whether they necessarily work better in some ways and worse in others and so on. We'd have to do a huge amount of research and speak to some legal experts internationally to understand that. But I think it's worth trying to say our existing system is very much like everything else that we talk about, rigged for the benefit of the powerful, and we need to go back to first principles and change it.
Yes, brilliant place to finish. Thank you so much, Rod. Yet again,
thanks for having me on again.
And you know, unbelievable in terms of the detail and the explanation. And it's hopefully from most readers and viewers, it's extremely straightforward. It's just about whether they have the will. Thank you so much, and see you next week. You take care.
Thanks again. Yep. See you next week.